We're consuming 1.7 planets per annum in terms of the capacity of the planet. Australia is the second highest consumer per capita of clothing globally, only behind the United States of America. We consume something in the order of 32 kilograms of textiles and clothing per annum per person.
We're going to hear some startling statistics today with Raj Kandiah. That was him talking about our consumption. We can really make a difference to the planet if we really consider how much we use. Following an illustrious career during which he's travelled the world, Raj remains a curious student of life. He's currently studying a Masters of Sustainability, and he's about to share with us his keen observations about what overconsumption means for our planet and its poorest people. Raj joined me at my warm table with a spirit of urgency and also hope that human ingenuity can turn the tide of some of our more pressing social and environmental issues, and that the actions and choices you and I take will make a difference. I'm Sonia Nolan, and I'm pleased to welcome you here at my warm table. Good morning and welcome to my warm table, Raj Kandiah. Thank you for being here today.
Thank you, Sonia. It's a pleasure.
It's really lovely to be able to talk everything sustainability with you today, Raj, because I know that we met at a workplace only in the last 6 months or so, and the idea of sustainability has been something that we have debated and discussed many times over, probably when we should have been doing other work. But anyway... That's the
and I'm happy to have
day.
this conversation because it is such a fascinating but vexing topic as well. So having the opportunity to speak a little bit more about it and explore some ideas is going to be fantastic.
Yeah, that's great. So that's that sort of dichotomy of sustainability that you've just already outlined, that it's vexing but it's exciting. So let's start with what vexes you in the area of sustainability at the moment.
So I feel, and I'm sure a lot of other people feel, that it's just so overwhelming and there's so many things that you're trying to tackle and we haven't been doing a good job of that, or we feel like we haven't been doing a good job of that. Why it vexes me is because there is so much negative news out there and we feel like we haven't done enough, particularly if you look at the intergovernmental report on climate change. You will see some really negative points of view around this whole notion that we can't get to the 2 degrees change of temperature, or limiting it to 2 degrees.
Is that by 2030 or by 2050?
No, the 2 degrees is actually by 2100.
By 2100?
Yes, because remember that what we're doing now, or what we're seeing in the atmosphere now, is actually a result of the years gone by. So it will take some time for it to change around. It's a bit like driving an oil tanker. You can't just sort of turn left. You have to make some decisions in advance to make changes.
And there must be some gates at what point we need to make those changes.
Yes, and I think what the IPCC said was that we're really going to struggle to get to 1.5, which was what they really said was what was desirable and what was needed to keep our lifestyle somewhat similar to what we're experiencing at the moment. Anything beyond 1.5 degrees means that we are going to have to change our lives, or our lives will change as a result of the changing climate.
Is that a bad thing? Because I just want to raise that point. Like, the lives that we are living now in the developed countries, is it such a bad thing that we might need to change things like overconsumption and consumerism and, some of those elements that are affecting sustainability?
No, 100%. It's not a bad thing, but it is also a global impact. And so you can't freeze or even go backwards for everybody in the position that we're in. Yes, the developed nations could go backwards, but and this is part of sustainability, is recognising that the less developed, non-developed countries are going to still develop. They're going to go forward. So that means we've got to come back even further. And I think whilst it's not a bad thing, it's what appetite do communities have to actually go backwards. And particularly when you think about all of the mantras such as greed is good and all of those sorts of things that we've been seeing since the 80s, really, that change in attitude to consume has a large impact on the planet, has a large impact on climate, but we can't sit here in our comfortable positions and tell the rest of the world that we're all going to go backwards.
And that's a really good point, actually, because I do want to talk about, and I know you want to talk about as well, the 3 pillars of sustainability. We certainly are very focused, and when we hear the word sustainability, we often immediately think of environmental sustainability. But there are, in fact, 3 pillars to sustainability, being environment, governance and social. And where you've just talked about developing nations, that social element of sustainability is really critical for them to actually move forward and have a sustainable future for their own communities in whatever way that's going to look like. But when we think about sustainability from a social point of view in a developed nation, we have a very different mindset of what that actually means.
Absolutely right. We really do jump to environment. We jump to recycled economies. We jump to reuse, repurpose, all of those good things, which are necessary, are going to be important, because at the moment we're consuming 1.7 planets per annum in terms of the capacity of the planet. And
1.7, sorry, can you just say that again?
Yeah.
1.7?
1.7, and that is a global average. So some of the developed worlds is well above 2 world. Some of the undeveloped, of course, is consuming less than their footprint. So,
Gosh.
And in the context of we only have one planet, that is just an incredible statistic to think about.
It's quite frightening.
It is very frightening. But again, this is where this vexing comes in, because there's those sorts of problems. But yet, on the other hand, you look at what human beings are capable of doing and what we do. And if you look back 20 odd years ago, we were facing, for example, a climate change of 4 degrees centigrade. We've already brought that down to expectations of being now maybe 3 or less, but we're not there yet. So we've got to get towards the 1.5 to 2 to really have an impact and not fundamentally change. And when I say the change of lifestyle, I don't just mean in the way we consume. I mean in places that we will live. Australia, for example, could become uninhabitable. It is such a marginal place to live anyway, in terms of desert and dryness and rainfall and so on. If you change the climate significantly, then it just might not be a place that people can live. And that's an extreme example, of course. And it's always this balance between understanding what the issues are and what the implications could be with what are we doing and how can we do it, and not getting sort of frozen by the fact that it's all too hard and let's just forget it. So that's the vexing of the messaging and of the problem.
And it's sort of holding that space and holding that tension, isn't it? So the vexing of we know and we need to identify and be really honest about what these issues are, and we need to think about then what are our own contributions to those issues at a very local and personal level.
That's right. I use the term, and I think it's been quite widely used, which is think global and act local. And that applies to governments, it applies to business, and it applies to all of us as individuals. So, yes, we think about all of those big issues. None of us individually are going to change the climate substantially. But if we all make our contribution, then we've got a chance of making the changes that are necessary for the planet.
So, and that's a really interesting point, because I know that I've had conversations with people in the past who say, look, Australia's only got 25 million people. We are just a drop in the ocean compared to some of the other nations around us that are polluting more than we are. And unless they have significant behavioural change amongst their population, whatever we do in Australia is really, it's not worth it. Don't bother. What do you say to those people?
Well, the first thing I say is that you're right on a gross number. We're very small. But on a per capita number, we're amongst the highest polluters in the world.
Are we really?
We are. We're amongst the highest contributors in the world because we're developed. We're a developed nation who is used to doing all sorts of things that contribute to the problems that we face. Think about Australia's cities. They're sprawled out all over the place. What do we worship the most in terms of our cities? We worship our cars. We use our cars to go everywhere. We have our education sector in one part of the city. We have our recreational sector in another part of the city. Our housing sector somewhere else. We have work often also in a different place. How do we get around? The only way you can efficiently get around is by car. And that in itself is contributing. Think back 100 years. What did cities look like? They were very small areas of land. People would interact and move from different parts of the city to each other, often by walking, maybe cycling. As cities got a little bit bigger, there was the option of public transport. But it's only been in the last 120 years that we've had this personal, individual thing called a motor car that we use. And Australian cities have very much been built and designed around the use of a motor car.
And that's so interesting, Raj, because you've taken my mind back to visiting my father's homeland in Italy. And I remember driving through there with my cousins, and the zoning, well, there was no zoning. I think that was the thing. So, and my husband and I were remarking, going, oh, look at this. You know, there's like a factory, and then there's like a house, and then there's like a farm, and then there's like a baker, and it's all within walking distance, as you've said. But we just thought, wow, this is just such a hodgepodge type of approach to things, and you can see that there is just no effective zoning there. But now you've just made me look at that in a completely different way, because, you know, we come here in Australia, it's all very, very orderly. Like you say, you know, we've got the light industrial area, and then we've got the heavy industrial area, and then we've got our, you know, commercial areas and zones. And yet you look at some of the movements now, which is, you know, infill in a lot of these places in regards to the city trying to have inhabitants in the city, so it's not just a business zone anymore. So are we moving back to, or we're trying to rezone or unzone?
Well, I think we should. And I think that's part of the behavioural change that we really need to see. We need to see people thinking differently about how we behave, how we interact, how we move around, both spatially and in the economy, because it's too easy to just sort of say, look, let's just replace a petrol vehicle with an electric vehicle and that will solve everything. In fact, it won't. There are all sorts of other issues with EVs that we can talk about, but it's actually changing behaviour. There's a site online, and I can't remember it right at the moment, but it will give you a walking score. It will tell you how walkable your particular neighbourhood is.
Oh, I like that.
Yeah, and I live very close to the city, so my walking score was something like 92 out of 100.
Right.
Yeah, which was absolutely fantastic. When I discussed this with a number of people in one of the units that I'm doing at university, there were people who came up with numbers of 4.
Really?
Meaning that they are so disconnected from everything to be able to interact without a car that they can't do it. And so that's a behavioural change that has got to come both ways. People wanting to change behaviour, but as you say, the planning needs to be different. And we've got to recognise that there's this sort of push and pull from top and bottom that's required.
Yeah, absolutely. So walking scores really interest me, so I'm going to have a think about that one. Thanks for that tip. Let's get back to this thinking globally and acting locally. So what else could we do? I guess one of the things already that we can get a take out from our conversation today is everybody go and check out your walking score. So we'll have that website noted on the notes for this podcast so that everyone can find that. So look out for it there in the notes. But what else can we do?
We could talk about recycling. what do we do? We sort of put it into a bin and we put it out the front, and we hope that that's going to then be done by our local government and recycled appropriately.
I've often wondered actually about the chain of what happens next once it goes into those recycling bins, and you sort of have this blind faith that, well, I've done the right thing, I've rinsed it out and I've popped it in the recycle bin, but then what happens?
Well, that's almost the unknown, isn't it? Because there's all sorts of stories that it all gets recombined and pushed off anyway. We used to send those sorts of things to other countries in the world, get rid of our rubbish by putting it into somebody else's.
Because that's a really effective solution, isn't it?
Well, it is for us, of course, but it's not.
And not from a global point of view, though,
Correct.
is it? And that's something that we'll touch on a bit more later on, where, this NIMBY mentality of not in my backyard, it's going to be in someone's backyard.
Well, it does if you produce the waste. So rather than thinking about what do we do and how do we dispose of it, think about how you're purchasing. What do you do when you go to the supermarket? Do you look for the thing that doesn't have as much packaging? And indeed, don't go to the supermarket. You go to the fruit and veg shop to buy your fruit and veg. You go to the butcher to buy your meat, etc., etc. And there you're buying for much more local, fresh, in-season product, as opposed to, why do we need a strawberry in the middle of the wrong season that's flown from the other side of the world, for example?
Oh, that's right. It's that sort of, you almost want little carbon miles sort of put on the bottom of your produce as you're buying it, especially when you're buying out of season. That's right. And I love the farmers markets, and I think we've seen a real revival of that probably in the last 10 years, where we've got a lot of farmers markets to choose from now, which is just a beautiful alternative.
Indeed. And that's that thinking thinking global but acting locally. It's really about what can you do and what are you doing locally. I went to a cafe in Albany and ordered what was a very lovely coffee scroll. That coffee scroll had come from France. Think of the miles that have gone into that, so therefore the carbon pollution. Think of the lack of labour that you're using locally. So the baker in Australia, in fact in Albany, who's probably just as capable to make those products as somebody in France, all of those sorts of things is just exemplary of what's wrong with what we're doing these days.
It's so excessive, isn't it? Because you're in Albany, you do not need a coffee scroll from France, and it does speak of overconsumption and excess and these seemingly luxuries that we're now starting to take for granted. I had a conversation with my mother-in-law probably a year or so ago, and we were talking about even the rise of the coffee culture. See, I actually have I love my coffee, so I'm going to be very clear in admitting that, but I think the rise of coffee culture has meant that we have so much wastage in coffee cups and the takeaway disposable coffee cups. We also now, it's taken for granted that you're not going to drink instant coffee when you go to someone's home, although I do love instant coffee too. But you're going to have an espresso, or you're going to have some, fandangled barista type of experience in somebody's home. And that is producing so much more waste from the point of view of the little capsules that we're getting rid of, and the disposable cups, and just this whole idea of putting on the kettle and having a spoonful of Nescafe is just not good enough anymore, and that's now seen as a basic.
Correct. And what's hidden in all of that, because we do think about the packaging we do think about the disposable or non-disposable disposable coffee cups, those sorts of things. What we don't think about is all the water it has taken to grow that coffee, often in places where water is scarce, where the basic needs of drinking water and so on are not being met for the population. So we're exporting our water consumption to a country that can ill afford it. That sort of impact, and this comes back to those three pillars, the social impact of some of the decisions we're making is equally as important and sometimes more confronting when you get into it than the environmental impact, because we're we're sitting in our very comfortable Western lifestyles and making these choices that we think are, oh, well, we're being a bit better because we'll bring along our own coffee cup to get the coffee. But we're not thinking that next step, that whole supply chain issue. Who's being impacted and how? Not just the sort of above the line issues that you see and are obvious around what we said, coffee cups, Nescafe pods, those sorts of things. What else is going on?
That is so confronting to think through, isn't it? And yet incredibly necessary. The idea of modern day slavery is absolutely embedded in that conversation. The idea of trying to work through all the supply chain elements, which become very confused down the line as well, because it's very hard to go from the Nescafe pod in my kitchen all the way down to the grower and the person who's picking and watering and making that coffee. So because there are so many steps along the way. How do we become more aware?
Yeah, and that's a very good point. Education and changing behaviours through education is very important. And again, this is sort of the act locally while you're thinking globally. It is this sort of bottom-up, top-down approach. We do need this information to be out there, and we need people such as government, such as those sorts of authorities who prepare the information. But we need a curious citizenry. They need to be able to and want to inquire and find out that information. So again, you can't just sit back and say, somebody's got to tell me all of this. You've got to want to go out and start looking.
We've got to stop being so passive, like real passive consumers.
Correct. Things can be done when we all want things to be done. Look, we had the success of the saving the ozone layer back in the 80s and 90s with the Montreal Protocol, where we got rid of CFCs from aerosols. That had a huge impact. It took some years, but it did have an impact. It can be done, and that's the other side of all of this, really, in that it is exciting. There are opportunities if we go out and look for them. But I think just going back to that whole value chain and the impact of social and governance and what are all the steps along the way, whilst coffee is a good example, the one that is really in my mind and is of focus is the electric vehicle. Because, again, as I said a little earlier, the whole notion that we can just replace all of our petrol vehicles or diesel vehicles with electric vehicles and that will solve the problem really is a misnomer for a couple of reasons. One, because, again, the Earth's resources are finite, but two, because actually the social impact of electric vehicles is that hidden sort of issue that nobody really wants to talk about. And the example, of course, is within electric vehicles. It's not an example. The real fact is cobalt. Cobalt is in every single lithium-ion battery. That's the one element that they haven't found some substitution for. 70% of cobalt comes from the Democratic Republic of Congo, the DRC, and 30% of the material coming out of the Congo is from artisanal mines. And those are mum and dad and children miners who have got no safety network, no social support, who are mining this material and finding its way all the way through to our electric vehicles.
Again, another very, very confronting fact. And children are dying.
Absolutely.
Every day.
Yep.
As they're mining the cobalt. And I was watching a documentary that you'd suggested, Raj, and read that article that you'd sent through. Again, I'll put those as a link on the podcast. We talk about the social element of sustainability and this idea that developing nations really need to have something to sustain them or some sort of industry to help them move forward economically, because that's going to be really important for them to rise economically and provide employment and opportunities for their futures. And then if an industry like cobalt, which 70% comes from the Democratic Republic of Congo, if an industry is replaced by another material or a synthetic-based material, whatever's going to be the future for cobalt, that actually then has devastating consequences for a a country or a community where most of their employment is based on that industry. It is such a vexed issue, as you've said.
Yes, and that's such a circular argument as well, because they're in a position where, yes, they've moved a little bit out of poverty, and albeit in very challenging working circumstances, no safety, still quite poor pay, but they've moved up that poverty chain, if you like. But the result of changing to something else will be that they'll potentially move back down again, but they'll have their lives. And again, who are we to sit in judgment as to which of those they would prefer?
Exactly.
And that comes back to that broader issue around developing nations versus the developed world and who's making the decisions. And that comes back to who's got the power. And of course, it's the developed world who largely have the power.
How do we, as normal everyday people in a developed world, in our own comfort, but really still wanting to be a good citizen, what are some of the things we should be thinking through?
Consumption is the biggest thing.
Just consumption.
Really. Think back to what our parents did, our grandparents did, and what they expected out of life. Think about the clothes, since we're talking about online shopping, clothing. How many shirts did your father or your grandfather have in his cupboard? How many shirts do you have now? Same with dresses. How many dresses did your grandmother or mother have in her cupboard? How many dresses do you have in your cupboard now? Are they all necessary? Australia is the second highest consumer per capita of clothing globally, only behind the United States of America. We consume something in the order of 32 kilograms of textiles and clothing per annum per person. It's
32 kilograms. Oh gosh, it's like we're talking about sugar or some sort of diet. So 32 kilograms of clothing per person in Australia, so second highest consumption in the world.
Correct.
Wow.
Yes, and think about that, because often those clothes are not the long-lasting. They're just the
fast fashion.
The seasonal. So what happens when they're no longer used? They get thrown away. So there's an environmental problem end to end. You've got the problem right at the beginning where you're using up resources to make those clothes. You're using up resources to transport those clothes to people, and then very quickly you're using up more resources to dispose of them. Often those clothes get sent to somebody else's place, not disposed of in Australia. And they don't even go to landfill. They just get stuck on a pile, and there's the environment being damaged right there.
So there's a whole bunch. There's the whole three pillars of sustainability in that example. So the environmental issue, from consumption of water and resources to make it. You've got the social element, where we look at a lot of the developing countries where most of the, even the luxury brands have outsourced their manufacture of these quality high class products, are actually being made in developing nations, and yet the price tag doesn't change.
That's right. They're being made in sweatshops in Bangladesh, for example. There was a recent example where one of those sweatshops, effectively the building fell over and killed a number of workers in there. Those workers were working for pennies per day to create, as you say, products for high-end luxury brands.
And then you've got the element of governance in there. So, and that is one of the key issues that just has to be addressed, in the sense of understanding that every single human being needs some sort of health and safety in their workplace, and some sort of fair conditions, and the equity and the empowerment of minority groups to actually have some sort of say in their destiny and the way that they work, and having companies really take governance seriously in the way that they treat their employees and the way that they affect their supply chains.
That's right. And I think we're starting to see a recognition from government that you can't just allow the free market to sort that out, because the market and players in the market will say, we're going to do all of these wonderful things. And indeed, they'll write all of these beautiful reports that say what wonderful things they're going to do. But who follows up on that, and how is it followed up on, and what is the consequence of them not doing it? The market people will argue that the consequence is that their share price will suffer. Well, maybe not.
But that then only affects a handful of people.
Correct. But I've read just this morning that the SEC in the United States,
What's the SEC?
Security and Exchanges Commission, will who really have oversight of what companies report and how they report, a bit like our stock exchange and ASIC here in Australia does. They are going to start looking into each of the companies' reporting and what they're reporting and what their results are, and make sure that there is a connection between the two. So it is something, again, that is starting to get some realisation happening, but there's more work to be done.
And it's interesting you say that, because I was having a conversation with another colleague the other day, and talking about that we've made some great leaps and bounds in regards to modern day slavery, and in the sense that we've now got some law, some legislation in regards to every large business has to look through all of their supply chains and identify any elements of slavery amongst the supply chain. And because I can be quite naive and a bit idealistic, one of my superpowers, and I was thinking, well, that's really great. That's huge leaps and bounds. And this person said, yes, it is. However, there's more that needs to be done, and people need to be held account. So exactly what you've just said is that accountability, that almost policing of it, or just who's actually checking to make sure that these claims and these good intentions are actually being delivered.
That's right, and it comes back to that term greenwashing. How much of it is real intent and real desire to make those changes, and how much of it is, I'm just going to say these things because I know it's what I've got to say, and I'll do the investigation. Nobody will know if I find something. And to your earlier point that there's layers through these supply chains, so it can be buried if we want it to be buried. Where does that come out in people? How are they dealing with what they find? And to your point also, what are the consequences of not dealing with it, and how do we reward those people who do deal with it? It's
vexing.
Another vexing.
That has to be what I'll call this podcast: the vexing issues of sustainability.
Yes, and it's that sort of messy, big picture, so much interplay and intertwined with each other that really does come out when you start thinking it through. And that's what I sort of try and instill on people, and in the conversations I have with people, it's very much about thinking about what else is going on. So what changes can I make that will have an impact somewhere through there? And you're going to have an impact, but think about it carefully and think about what I can do differently. Go to a farmer's market, buy less stuff, ultimately. Recycle what waste you do use, but be mindful of what waste you're bringing into the household before you're even sending it out. All of those sorts of things. They're small, but we really need to focus on them and think about them. And then you can go on and do more things. Actually join the farmers market, join the local community who are collecting sand shoes to send to underprivileged children somewhere in the world. There's a whole lot of other things that can be done, but start small, but start doing it today.
Yeah, really good message. And it all comes back to this idea of civic society. It all comes back to this understanding of connection. And if I remember someone said that, your grandmother used to say that if it's got a package around it, then it's not, then you're too far removed from where it came from. You should be able to pick a banana and eat and peel the banana. That's the packaging, right? So, we're too removed in many situations from where things originated. So it's actually understanding the origin of things.
I saw a wonderful picture of an orange in the United States of America. It had been peeled, and had been put into a plastic container to keep it. Yes.
Oh my goodness.
So it's those sorts of things. I mean, we don't see as much of that here, but it's looking out for those sorts of things. that really will make a difference.
Yeah, it is. Something came across my social media feed the other day, which was a shampoo bottle. And this is something that, again, vexes me, is that the packaging of, everyday things. Like we need shampoo, but I don't want to have to buy. I want to go somewhere and refill my bottle of shampoo. There's those sorts of places that, we need to see more and more of those springing up around the place, like the loose produce type of places, really important from a packaging point of view. But I saw this shampoo bottle that was actually made out of soap. Have you seen that one, Raj? Yeah.
Yes.
So I
Yes.
thought that was just, this is exactly the sort of things that we need to start thinking about, is to reduce packaging. Because I think the little ad was talking about we would buy something like 13 bottles of shampoo and conditioner per year, and 10 bottles of shower gel if that's what you use. And so that's 23 bottles per household that you're disposing of, whereas actually having the packaging being useful is really where we want to get to.
Again, think back to what our grandparents did in terms of their shopping. They would go to the local grocer
Or they'd grow it in their
well,
backyard.
yes, they certainly would do that. But what they needed and couldn't grow, they would take a little paper bag or a container and they would fill up from bulk. They wouldn't have everything packaged out for them. And this is really important in the context of world population. In 1800, there was about 1 billion people on the planet. It took until 1930 to get to 2 billion people. We are now sitting at over 7 billion people on the planet between 1930 and 2020, so less than 100 years. We have gone to 7 billion people. That's an enormous strain on the planet alone, let alone the developing and development that people are going through, and a lot of those people wanting to emulate the success of the West.
That's it, and the overconsumption.
And the overconsumption of the West, yes.
I want to talk about climate change. I know we sort of touched around that issue a little bit, but let's get to some of the heart issues of climate change and what we're seeing in Australia. We're seeing floods, we're seeing fires, and people are still saying, well, that's unfortunate. That's not climate change.
That's outliers of normal climate. And there's a lot of people saying that. And I think, again, we've got to look at the science. We've got to think about it in terms of what's happened. So for 10,000 years, our climate has barely changed. The temperature in the atmosphere has essentially not moved, maybe by plus or minus half a degree. Yet in the last 30 to 50 years anyway, we've moved up by 1.2 degrees. So we're now outside of that normal range. And the climate scientists will tell you that that is resulting in a change in climate. And you've touched on a couple of really good ones. So the floods in Australia, bushfires in Australia. But look beyond Australia's borders. The bushfires that occurred in Canada last year, they had in an area the hottest summer on record, and bushfires in places that have never seen fire like that before. We had the floods that occurred in Germany. Again, that was weather-induced. 3 weekends ago, the climate at both poles, the North Pole and the South Pole, were between 30 and 40 degrees above the normal temperature that you would expect to see at those poles. So what that's saying is that the poles are melting. Now, again, there is so many ramifications on that. Obviously, sea level is rising as a result. But also, you're reducing the amount of white polar cap, which means you are reducing the amount of sunlight that is reflected back from the Earth, i.e. more sunlight is being reflected. That results in greater warming again. So you're getting these feedback cycles starting to happen where the more it happens, the more it happens. And that is really the issue that we're seeing. And to the people who sort of don't believe that climate change is human-induced, the thing I say to those people is, all right, forget about it being human-induced or not. It is happening. We are now more intelligent beings than we were 1,000 or a couple of thousand years ago, what can we do to try and slow that down? Surely we're not going to just sit by passively and watch all of those things happen without making some attempt to reverse it. Because if we don't, the impact of those events is not just the immediate impact, but it's the cost of remediation, the cost of adaptation, the cost of change. The floods in Australia. Lismore is clearly on a floodplain. What's the cost of relocating Lismore somewhere else and all the people within it? Those are the sorts of things, again, that we need to be thinking about, we need to be talking about. How can we keep on letting developers build on floodplains? And yet we do. So all of those things, again, connect together that say climate change and environmental change is happening. What are we going to do to make a difference?
And do you have faith, Raj, that we can think outside the boxes that we currently are ticking for sustainability?
So I do. Human ingenuity is beyond comprehension in many ways. Look at what we have done. Look at the successes we've had as society. Look at, life expectancy. Look at birth survival rates. All of those sorts of things. We've made huge changes and huge positive changes, and we can do so in this space also. But we've got to want to. And I think the thing with climate change is, and indeed sustainability in general, is all of these things are happening at a slower rate than would be confronting enough, although arguably in the last 12 months what we've seen in severe weather events might be starting to get more people to understand. But because things happen more slowly, it's not front of mind. It's not something that we're always thinking about, and yet we do need to think about it, because we need to think about it in the context of what actions can we take, what changes can we make individually that will contribute to things being better.
And there's a lot we can do, and we need to, and the first one is to get curious.
That's
and
right.
actually work out what we're doing individually to affect climate change, to affect disparity in other countries, and rethinking our consumption. So there's a lot we can already do in our own little, like you said, think globally, act locally.
Sustainability is messy. That's part of the whole issue in many ways, is that people want to have everything in nice, clear boxes, and they can work out what's happening in each and every one of those, and refuse to see that it's all so connected in such a messy, horrible way. But that's the important part of it, actually.
And that's exactly it, Raj, is that it's all about complexity, and complexity, the only way, like I did this theory years ago. I think I've shared with you the Cynefin theory that I learnt, and it talks about, basic and simple, then you've got complicated, complex, and chaos. And I won't go into all of the details there, but we try to make things complicated in the sense of we want to tick boxes and tick them off, like you've just said, put it in a box, put it away, it's dealt with. But in fact, complexity, which is where all of the things we've talked about today sit, complexity is all about relationships.
That's right.
And relationships are all about trust and connection and communication, and definitely messiness, but having that respectful opportunity and the curiosity to ask the right questions in order to build those relationships, to try and address complexity. We're never going to solve it, but we can certainly make these huge leaps and bounds towards addressing it in a really positive way.
We can make those leaps and bounds if we understand the messiness. But I think the word you use there is really important. It's trust. And trust, I do think, humans are social beings, and they do need to interact with others, I believe, physically and in conversation. But we can only do that when we have trust, and you can only build trust by doing it.
Raj, I want to now move to thinking back to your humble beginnings, maybe not so humble.
Quite humble.
Quite
indeed.
humble. And your background, you've shared with me that, well, I guess when we're talking about where we need to get back to, you talk about your grandfather, and he's a man that you hope to emulate in your life. So tell me a bit about your grandfather, and tell me a bit about your background.
Yeah, so my grandfather was born in the late 1800s. So a long time ago, many more than the number of generations you would expect. He went to war very early. He signed up, and because this is the First World War. This was an adventure for the lads, and he went younger than he should have, but that was what a lot of them did. But because of that, he got a lot of different experiences that you wouldn't have because the world wasn't as global as it is today. He fought in the trenches in Europe and brought all of that back with him. But like a lot of people of those days, really didn't talk about any of that. What it meant, though, was that he then got married quite late in life, and then my mother was born sort of late in that generational thing, if you like. But I remember having a lot of time with my grandparents. In fact, school holidays, both my parents worked. School holidays would be spent with my grandparents. And he was just such this gentle, lovely man who nothing was an issue, nothing was a problem. He would walk around and talk to everybody around the village that they lived in. He was just a lovely man who really thought about others, put himself in other people's positions and tried to think about how they were. Now, he would have been completely confronted by what my mother did, which was marry this foreigner, and yet was so accepting of that, obviously. And so, whilst he was put outside of his comfort zone, he still managed to find ways to adapt to that and still respect that. And that's the sort of thing that I see and what I would like to do is to really understand positions from other people's points of view and therefore think about things from a more holistic global perspective. And I've tried to build that through my life. My parents struggled in the beginning, as I said. So we were talking about my father came to Australia. He was one of the first non-white migrants, if you like.
Where did he come from, Raj?
He came from Malaysia. He came out as having finished high school there under the British system, came to Australia and was immediately told that's not acceptable. He'll have to go back to high school. Remember that we're talking about a time which we had the White Australia policy in Australia. So we're going a fair way back. But that had all sorts of challenges. My parents told me that the Department of Immigration would come around and check that my father's clothes were still in the cupboard after they got married to be sure that it was a real marriage, not a sham marriage, so to try and get him to be able to stay. Anyway, so had fairly humble beginnings in terms of the situation that I was brought up in. My mum, very smart individual. She was studying, went to university quite young, had been very successful at high school, had sort of top in the state in a number of different subjects. So a big thinker and helped me to understand what thinking and education and all of those sorts of things meant, and being curious. We've said that earlier, and I think that's very, very important. And so that's the way that I've always been, and I've found ways to get to have a job that has got me out and about and to different parts of the world, again to see life from other people's perspective, to interact and discuss with other people, really on a whole range of different things, but to understand things from another person's perspective is just so powerful. And I'm trying to instill that into my children as well. So I have already done quite a bit of study in my life, and I'm back to studying again. And that's all about just getting that learning, getting that information, getting that knowledge, and being curious.
It just sounds like there's a lot of life lessons that you've learnt from your own background, your own intergenerational opportunity of having your grandparents as such a significant influence in your life, and also through the intelligence of your mother and the bravery of your father. So it sounds like all of that is wrapped into this amazing individual that I've come to know, Raj. And I want to thank you sincerely for taking your time today to talk to me on My Warm Table. And I really hope that it's the beginning of more conversations about what we can do in the area of sustainability, because it is absolutely one of the critical areas that we all need to think about and that we can all actually impact in our own way.
It's been a pleasure, Sonia. It really has. And look, I'd like to leave with people thinking we can do it, and we can do it as an individual. Every contribution we make is important.
You've been listening to My Warm Table with Sonia Nolan. In Italian, a tavola calda is a warm and welcoming table where you can share big ideas, friendship, laughter and life. So much happens around the kitchen table, and I wanted to amplify it here in this podcast. My aim is to feed your mind and soul through smart conversations with heart. No topic is off limits, but good table manners rule. I hope you'll join us each week as we set the table for my extraordinary guests who will let you feast on their deep knowledge, life experiences and wise insights. Let's keep the conversation flowing. Please subscribe to the My Warm Table podcast and share it with your friends and networks. Perhaps if they are new to podcasting, take a moment to show them how to download and subscribe so they don't miss an episode either. I'd also love you to join our community on Facebook. You'll find the group at My Warm Table Podcast. Your support is very much appreciated.